So way back on the original Brexit day of the 29th of March, and fortified with tea and sandwiches, I made my way to the storming of the Bastille, or rather the Houses of Parliament, and found not open revolt, but instead polite debate, as usual. And feeling pretty daft about what I'd hoped to find, and rather than trying to start the revolution myself, and at admittedly very short notice, I decided to make the best of it and join in the discussion. The revolution would have to wait while we got organised. But whilst I was there, I did meet some fairly interesting people, like this reprobate, who you may know.
Hello everyone, how's it going?
It is Sargon. So how are you, sir?
I'm really well, I'm really glad it's not raining.
And this chap, who you may not.
Well, I'm here at the Houses of Parliament. This is not quite the day for revolution I was expecting, but I am meeting some interesting people here. And one of those interesting people is...
Hi, my name's Jonathan Golden. I've come all the way from Gibraltar to represent the 34,000 Gibraltarians and also the 12,000 frontier workers, many of which are in Spain who cross every day. And the reason I'm here is I've been following very closely the debates around Brexit, and not once have I seen one Gibraltar flag. So I'm here to put that right.
Oh, well done. Look, there we go. There's the Gibraltar flag. For anybody who didn't know what it looks like, it's kind of a castle on there, but you may have to look it up. So I guess you've got a fairly unique perspective around here on this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in Gibraltar, it's the most Remain part of the United Kingdom. It's technically not part of the United Kingdom, it is a British overseas territory. We're a bit upset to be called a colony. So again, I think we need to make our voice heard. And, to be remembered, really. 96% of us voted to remain, and people are very passionate about that.
Yeah, well, I can't argue with that. I mean, why do you feel upset to be called a colony, particularly?
Well, obviously, there's 300 years and a bit of history between the UK and Spain. We have a 2006 constitution. We consider ourselves a British overseas territory. We're self-governing. It's a bit immature, we feel, to be called a colony.
I see. Okay. So, what do you think of the developments been happening in Houses of Parliament then?
Absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's been semi drama on Netflix at the moment, and the plot line's obviously thicken. What's going to happen next? I have no idea, and I think there's lots of political pundits more qualified than I that are also in the dark.
Well, okay. Well, thanks very much, and I'll be sure to promote your point of view.
All right. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.
And since he was good enough to speak to me, I said I'd publicise the issue from the particular viewpoint of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is, as Jonathan said, a self-governing British overseas territory and not, as he insisted, a colony. No British colonies actually exist anymore, but unlike Bermuda, St Helena and the Turks and Caicos Islands, Bermuda is the only British overseas territory that is actually a part of the European Union. Home to 34,000 fiercely patriotic Brits and 12,000 commuting workers from neighbouring Spain. The territory was ceded to Britain in perpetuity in 1713 at the Treaty of Utrecht, although it is often and repeatedly been claimed by Spain. I say fiercely patriotic because they had a referendum in 2002 in which they were offered dual citizenship with Spain, and they rejected it on a 100% turnout to the tune of a fraction under 99%. So you might imagine that Gibraltarians, patriotic as they obviously are, might be tempted to vote for Brexit, but not a bit of it. They voted almost as resoundingly, 96% in fact, for Remain on a comparatively apathetic turnout of only 82%. Now that's what I call engagement. And so we have a conundrum. What happens when a distinct section of the British electorate votes against the majority? Gibraltar is an extreme example, but as extreme as it is, that doesn't mean it's not valid. Gibraltar is fiercely patriotic, and at the same time, fiercely in favour of Britain's membership of the EU. But what of the other remainder chunks of the UK, with particular reference to Nicola Sturgeon's recent announcement of her intention to go for Indy Ref 2 in Scotland? For the moment, let's start with London. London is Well, what is London exactly? Ostensibly the capital city, both of England and of the United Kingdom. But is it fiercely patriotic? Hardly, I would have said. The fact that London happens to be located within the borders of the UK is perhaps its only real link to the UK. London is supposedly the powerhouse of the British economy, but it's far from obvious what Britain gains from having it. There is, I suppose, a fair amount of tax revenue to be had, but since the core principle of much business in the City of London is exclusively to make money for itself and to avoid paying any tax whatsoever, that advantage can hardly be taken for granted. I live 35 miles from the centre of London and pay a mortgage on a very modest home. My children, however, will never be able to afford to buy a house in this area, even if they live for 500 years. And the reason for that is London. London is the world's premier global city and welcomes people from all over the world. All except the indigenous population, of course, who continue to be marginalised by newcomers with every passing day. It is the world's most cosmopolitan city and is home to an enormous number of people for whom English is, at best, a second language, and at worst, not spoken at all, by people who have no affection for the country they live in, nor for those they live amongst. In addition, London is the city of choice for Saudi royals, Russian plutocrats, and other assorted foreign billionaires, who are welcomed by a conscienceless British establishment who flatter them, carry their bags, and lick their arses like toadying butlers and expect nothing from them except the crumbs that fall from the tables of their property deals. All they bring to this country is house prices inflated by the empty flats they buy for investment that ripple outwards, in my case, all the way to the south coast. I could take advantage of this trickle down and by selling up and moving 150 miles away from London. But that won't help my kids. Nah. For all its smug self-promotion, I reckon London takes as much as it gives. If it were up to me, and on a bad day, I'd pull the plug on the Circle Line and let it drown, happily taking Parliament with it. For anyone who knows the relationship between England and Scotland, it is hardly a surprise that Scotland voted as it did. Chuck into the mix that Scotland had its own independence referendum in 2014, which was hardly resoundingly defeated by 55 to 45%. Scottish solidarity with England should never have been taken for granted. And Scotland has been taken for granted again and again for the past 50 years, and disgracefully so in my opinion. Being largely reliant on coal mining and heavy industry like shipbuilding, Scotland has suffered disproportionately from Britain's deindustrialisation since the 70s. This caused understandable resentment, generally towards the English, especially towards the Conservatives, and specifically towards Margaret Thatcher, who the Scots never voted for and got again and again and again. So it's understandable that Scotland might prefer to throw their lot in with the Europeans. It's wrong, because the EU is hardly likely to be any more respectful of Scotland than the English, and probably a good deal less. But it's understandable. Were it not for the fact that the UK is made up of 4 nations and not 2, I'd move the Parliament up to Edinburgh and let the Scots be in the driving seat for a change. Not only would the whisky slurpers feel a bit more involved for once, but it would also drag the political centre of gravity up north, along with much else, and ease the pressure on the crowded southeast. But then that's just me. And so we come to Ireland, or Northern Ireland to be precise, and that is quite a distinction. It's the distinction, you could say, since the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will become the de facto border between a post-Brexit United Kingdom and the European Union. However, one of the main parts of the Good Friday Agreement was that there was to be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Inexplicably, nobody from the British government or the British civil service happened to notice that this might actually be somewhat of a sticking point before the referendum was held or even proposed. It's possible the Irish government, the Northern Ireland Assembly, or even the EU itself brought it up, but I certainly don't remember if they did. And what about the press? They can normally be relied upon to stir the pot and to highlight the cruel injustice of a Remain area being dragged out of the EU against its will, as Nicola Sturgeon whined again and again from Scotland and was faithfully repeated by the oh-so-impartial BBC, an organisation never known to miss an opportunity to paint the hated UK in a shitty light. So the referendum was held, the result announced, and it was only after the establishment had collectively picked itself up off the floor did anyone so much as mention the possibly insoluble issue of the Irish border. Whilst it's probably true that this particular detail was not uppermost in the minds of the great majority of the British public, I think we can grant them some slack in this regard. No such slack is to be offered to the British government, and certainly none that they deserve. The fact that the British government had been, shall we say, remiss in this instance is something that we've all got rather used to. This was further proof, if further proof was needed, that the British government are indeed just as useless and incompetent as we all feared they might be. But we are left with this central conundrum. What happens when a distinct part of the UK votes against other, larger parts? Well, it certainly isn't obvious. Northern Ireland, as with Gibraltar, always was going to be an issue, as we all now realise in hindsight, due to its border with an existing EU member. London is a city, a global one at that, but whether those living in it like it or not, remains the capital city of the UK, and that should be its primary purpose, namely to be an asset for the country that it is located within. Scotland, as I say, is properly distinct, but for better or worse, after rejecting independence in 2014, also remains in the UK. So Scots may say they are being dragged out of the EU against their will, and it's hard to argue against that, considering the result in Scotland. But where do we draw the line? If we allow Scotland to separate, should we also allow the same for Northern Ireland? And what about London? Or even parts of the Cotswolds, which were some of the only other Remain areas of the UK. Sevenoaks voted Leave, but neighbouring Bromley voted Remain. Should Bromley's desire to remain not be upheld? After all, democratically it should. But there will be streets within Bromley that voted Leave. Should that decision not be taken into account? And what about individual households, or even individuals? I'm taking this to an extreme to illustrate a point. That point being that at what point must we defer to people's desire for self-determination? And I am painfully aware of the central contradiction of wanting Britain to be independent of the EU, but at the same time desperately wanting Scotland to remain with England. But this contradiction is not England's alone. How would Scots justify their domination over Shetland or Orkney, or over the fishing areas around Aberdeen, Peterhead and Fraserburgh, that may not relish the implications of Scotland returning to the EU? The reason I'm exploring this is because the thing that worries me most about Brexit, more than the economy, more than our relationship with Europe, more than our standing in the world, all of which will recover. Now, the thing that worries me most about Brexit is that we may lose Scotland in the process. I was over the moon in 2014 when Scotland rejected independence, and I will be heartbroken if they choose to separate from us now. Not because I wish to lord it over Scotland like one of Ewan McGregor's effete arseholes, but because I do genuinely feel, without a trace of full sincerity, that losing Scotland will be a catastrophe of immeasurable proportions, and one from which we may never recover. Of course we'll recover economically, but psychologically I'm not so sure. Britain is Britain, and Scotland is Britain, at least as much as England is, in my eyes. I've never been much of an English patriot, to be honest. England to me is quiet and comforting, all cream teas and cricket. Now, don't get me wrong, I like tea and I like cricket, and I certainly love my home. But I invest my patriotism in Britain. Because it is Britain, and in no way just England, that has been such an enormous force for good in the world. And it was as Britain that we did our greatest things, culminating in the greatest achievement of all, that of the defeat of Nazi Germany, with only the Soviet Union, the United States and the rest of the British Empire to help us out. But nevertheless, Britain is a team, perhaps the best team ever. It's certainly the best team I've ever been part of. Now, to all you Scots out there who may be listening to this, my guess is you're not convinced that I'm just another English wanker who ignores Scotland and will sell it down the river the first chance I get. If I'm so concerned about keeping Scotland in the Union, then why don't I support Remain? That's a good question. I don't support Remain because I know that the snuffing out of the British identity by the EU will include doing the exact same thing to Scotland. Not at first, perhaps, when a newly independent Scotland will be welcomed into the the fold, particularly as it will draw significant cultural capital away from England and add to England's status as a pariah nation, as a warning to other EU members who may be tempted to break free. But once Scotland's usefulness as a stick with which to beat England has been exhausted, Scotland will return to what it was before to them, namely a tiny, unimportant, and crucially, utterly ignorable region of the European Empire. What it will never be, as far as the European Union is concerned, is a proud, much less an independent nation. But this enmity between Scotland and England, or rather this hostility from many Scots towards England, might be a more correct way of putting it, since I've scarcely heard a bad word about Scotland from an English person, is not something I'm sure I'm really buying. After all, Scotland did reject independence, or rather separation, as I would put it, since Scotland is in no real way dependent upon England. And I don't think that decision was necessarily dependent upon the UK remaining within the EU, despite what Nicola Sturgeon might like us to believe. Now, the reason I'm not buying it is because the second that England is threatened in any concrete way, Scotland, almost as a reflex, comes to her defence. Now, the Scots never want us to win at football, which we seldom do, although not as seldom as Scotland does. But like a dog that wags its tail whilst barking at you, the impression is that they don't really mean it. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Scots do hate us. Maybe my pathetic desire, no matter how genuine, to have Scotland like us is just a massive chunk of wishful thinking on my part. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe all patriotism is just emotional idiocy wrapped up as virtue, whether it's being done by a Brit, a Scot, or a Gibraltarian. And maybe all it is at the present moment is the opportunity to express a selfish desire to oppose the prevailing wind. But it is opposition, even if all it is opposition to globalisation and to the direction in which the world is heading. It's worth having, just for that. It might just be the only thing that will stop them.